this point from the start of the 2021 NFL League year. And at the same time, it starts the 2021 Dynasty Owner League year. Everybody should be very excited about that. I know I am. We have the announcement earlier this week that the NFL salary cap is going to be $182.5 million, which means that the Dynasty Owner salary cap is going to be 70% of that, which means it's going to be $127.75 million. And I, for one, am very happy about that because I've got a lot of players that I need to fit into my salary cap, and I need that extra room. But we're not talking about that today. We'll talk about that a lot next week. What we're going to talk about today is the third in my series on how to draft your Dynasty Owner startup team. So this is part three on how to draft your Dynasty Owner champion. And this week, what we're going to do is we're going to talk about the players that you need to draft. The first week we talked about 3 measures that didn't really involve players, positions, or salaries. The second week we talked about the salary range for the player that you need to draft with your first round pick, and learn that you really should be drafting the lower salary players with your first round pick, if at all possible. And that doesn't change regardless of injuries or underperformance. And so now the next logical step in this progression is that we're going to talk about, well, what players were the best ones to draft in 2020? Which players were on the most Dynasty Owner Fantasy Championship teams, and kind of which players were on the fewest, or there any players who really tanked your team if you had them on your team. So first thing we're going to talk about is which players were the best first-round draft picks. And if you watched the video or read the article on part 2, you know about the lower the salary, the better. So it should come as no surprise that the person we want to have with our first pick, was Alvin Kamara. As you can see, he was the first-round draft pick on 18% of the winners in the 2020 Dynasty Owner season. And if you wanted to get into the chase for the ring, he was even better, as he was on in 32% of the top 25 teams, and he was drafted first on 4 out of the top 10 teams. So, and not surprisingly, one of those teams was our second place finisher, Quarantine for Greatness. He finished in second, and he drafted Alvin Kamara with his first pick. But interestingly, the second person on that list was Patrick Mahomes, and he was the first-round pick of our ring winner, Barbie Kilgore. And that was because that's who he got at that point, because Alvin Kamara had already been selected by the time that Victor got to draft. So as you can see, it was last year, it was Alvin Kamara was the guy that you really wanted to have. And so now we need to see who's the player who we want to have this year. But first, before we start looking at 2021, let's keep looking at 2020, and let's talk about our next topic, which was what players were drafted by the most league winners. So were there certain players, regardless of whether they were taken in the first round or later, were there certain players who appeared on a lot of championship teams? Was there some guy who was the difference maker for the Dynasty Owner teams? He didn't have to be drafted in the first round. I mean, you've got 25 rounds of picks to make in your Dynasty Owner draft, and you just can't rest after your first pick. You can't take Alvin Kamara or the guy you think is going to be the best one in 2021 and say, I'm done, that's it, time to go, set it on auto draft. And what we found this year when looking at the draft, we found that there were a total of 590 players who were selected in any round of Dynasty Owner drafts. And these players run the gamut. You got from you got A.J. Dillon, Aaron Jones, and you've got Zane Gonzalez and Zay Jones at the end. And they range from, you've got the GOAT, Tom Brady, who was drafted obviously by a lot of Dynasty Owner teams and the 7-time Super Bowl champion. And then you've got some obscure players. I looked through all of them, and some of the most obscure players I found were Jamar Smith, who's a quarterback, Cameron Scarlett, who's a running back, DJ Montgomery, who's a wide receiver, Sean McKeon, who's a tight end, and your obscure kicker for the day is Dominic Elbury. I don't even know how to pronounce his name. I have never heard of any of those 5 guys. So, but some Dynasty owners did, and at least one dynasty owner drafted each one of those guys in their dynasty owner startup draft last year. But so you got a 12-team league, which means, every player's got an equal chance of being on a winner, and that's about a little over 8% of. On average, if players were evenly distributed on championship teams, you would be about 8.3% of the teams. Well, some players are on a higher percentage of teams. So which ones are those players? One thing we could look at, you just can't look at overall percentage, because if you look at overall percentage, if there's somebody who was drafted by one dynasty owner team and happened to be on the championship, regardless of who he was, then, he would be the most valuable player in dynasty owner. And that's not the case. So we're going to have some criteria. And what I've decided is that you've got to be drafted in at least 50% of leagues. So that's going to get rid of our top five, the five guys who were selected in one dynasty owner league and one only, and happen to be drafted by the team that won the championship. Those players are a who's who of Pro Bowl players. Actually, not really. It's Blaine Gabbert, Chandler Catanzaro, Devin Ross, Logan Woodside, and Olamide Zacarias, whose name I probably just mispronounced. So now that we know, we're just looking at the players who are widely owned, widely drafted in Dynasty Owner. So let's take a look at that list, and we'll find a surprising name at the top of the list. You've got Jonnu Smith, the former Tennessee Titans tight end, who was drafted on the most league champion teams. He appeared on 21.1% of league champion drafts. After him is no surprise, it's our friend Alvin Kamara. He was drafted mostly in the first round. I know it's at 18%, but he was in a couple of leagues, believe it or not. Kamara wasn't a first-round pick, and a couple of those players who got him in the second round ended up winning their championship. I mean, could you imagine if you had gotten Mahomes and Kamara with your first two picks? You would have been golden. I don't think anybody did that, but that would have been great. After Kamara, tied with him, we see Travis Kelce as the third player, and then fourth is Stephon Diggs, which is interesting because he's a high salary wide receiver, which we found when you wanted to talk about drafting your first round pick, you didn't really want one of those high salary wide receivers. That was kind of those were kind of the least likely to win a championship if you drafted one of those guys. In fifth, we've got Malcolm Brown, who was drafted by 19% of league champions. Then Josh Allen, who's the only quarterback in the top 10 list here is Josh Allen, which is interesting because I thought that there would be a lot of your Aaron Rodgers, who was the number one player in Dynasty Owner last year, your Russell Wilsons, your Patrick Mahomes. But interestingly, only Mahomes was above average in terms of the number of teams that he appeared on. And even more interesting was that the players second most likely to appear on a Dynasty Owner championship team was Bears quarterback Mitchell Trubisky. I'm sure most of the people didn't actually use Mitchell Trubisky too much, but he was drafted by a lot of them. Not enough to appear on this list. It was about 12%, but still, he was the second best quarterback. The quarterback who was drafted by the most championship teams. He was the second ranked of those quarterbacks. So then after that, we have we have receivers. We have Robert Woods, Calvin Ridley, Darren Waller, Derrick Henry, Duke Johnson, and at the bottom, which you might not be able to see, we have Mike Evans. So interesting stuff there, I believe. So I think it goes to show that the quarterback there was only one out of the top 10 who appeared there, and that was Josh Allen. So if you want to win, you've got to hit on the right quarterback. And Allen was a good quarterback last year. He was the number 2 ranked quarterback in Dynasty Owner, and his salary was only $5 million. In contrast, Aaron Rodgers, who was the number 1 quarterback, was only on 5% of league championship teams. And that's probably because of his salary. His salary is $33.5 million. So it's going to cost you a lot more to get just a little bit extra production from Aaron Rodgers. And having Josh Allen on your team, you get almost the same production, and you just have $28 million more that last year that you could have used to get some other good players like his receiver Stephon Diggs. So and then the final point I want to make about this list is that it shows that two of the players on the list there were those high salary wide receivers, the ones you didn't really want to get early in the first round. But if you draft them later, like Diggs his ADP was over 100. It was 102.3, and Evans, his was 58.1. It shows that those guys, if they produce, can be helpful to your team despite their high salaries. It's just when you take one of those guys early and they don't produce or they get hurt, it really damages your team, your ability to draft better players to help the rest of your team. But so it doesn't mean avoid those high-priced wide receivers completely. It just means you need to draft them in a more appropriate spot, not the first round. At least that's what I think. That's my interpretation of the data. And finally, just to take a quick look, we're going to take a quick look and see if there are a lot of players who were drafted by the fewest league winners. And obviously, there were a lot of players who weren't drafted by anybody who won a championship. I mean, we had a lot of players drafted on one or two teams. So, but I thought I would take a look and see. I wanted to see if there was a player who was just bad, just had bad mojo in the season, and you just didn't want him on your team. And the two that came up the most, they weren't drafted in a lot of leagues. They were drafted in about 25% or a little over 25% of leagues. But was J.J. Taylor, running back for the New England Patriots, and Riley Ridley, the wide receiver for the Chicago Bears. Both of them, they were on the largest number of teams, drafted by the largest number of teams, and failed to be on a team drafted by a team that won the championship. Two other players who appeared on quite a few teams were some kind of high salary wide receivers, not over 10 million, but approaching 10 million, and Cole Beasley, who had a good season. So that was kind of a surprise to me. And Randall Cobb, who really didn't have a good season. He got hurt and didn't play a lot, and he cost you $9 million a year. So it's not a surprise that he didn't help out too many dynasty owner teams. But we have the award for the worst player to draft in dynasty owner in 2020. And I hate to pick on this guy. I mean, he gets picked on a lot in fantasy football for good reason. It is J.J. Arcega-Whiteside of the Philadelphia Eagles. So JJ was drafted in every single dynasty owner league. All of them, somebody drafted him, whether he was drafted early, drafted late. He was drafted in every league, because, the Eagles didn't have a lot of wide receivers. He makes only a little over $1.2 million a year. But overall, over all those drafts, all those teams that took him, he was only on two dynasty owner league championship teams, or he was only drafted by two league champions. Another player, Royce Freeman of the Denver Broncos, was also drafted on only two winning teams, but he was drafted in only 91% of leagues, so he's actually a tiny bit better. So that's why we're giving the award to JJ. So congratulations, sort of, to you, JJ. So that's it. That's part 3 of how to draft your dynasty owner champion. I'm very excited. We are only a week away from the 2021 season. So this is going to close out our series on how to draft the champion. Because next week we are going to be able to talk a lot about salaries. We're going to have new salaries for players. We're starting to get some of them coming in right now. Players are re-signing with their teams or getting franchise tagged, and you're going to have a rough idea of their salary. But pretty soon we're going to know what everybody's salary is, and we're going to have to start adjusting our teams for those of us who have been in the league for a while. We can start mock drafting for those of you who are new or looking to start up a team, so you can have actual real salaries in those mock drafts. So let me know. So that's 2020, but what's going to happen in 2021? What players are going to be the best ones to draft? Is Alvin Kamara and Patrick Mahomes going to be good to draft again early, or because they're no longer affordable with their salary increases, is that going to make them less likely to appear on dynasty owner championship teams and chase for the ring contention teams? What players, based on the salaries that right now, what players do you think are going to be the best ones in 2021? Send me a tweet at SteveBT33. Drop a comment in the comments here on YouTube. Let everybody know what you think. What's going to happen. So thanks for watching. Be sure to watch all the other videos from all the other writers and follow all the other writers on Dynasty Owner. And thank you very much. And we'll be back next week, and we can start really getting into the 2021 season. I'm looking forward to it. Thanks a bunch. Have a good day. Bye.